Each year, this report provides us with a very troubling reminder of the high number of children that live in poverty in British Columbia. And we're disappointed to report that the fundamental statistic remains the same, which is that there are 1 in 5 children in British Columbia that live in poverty. That amounts to 153,300 children that go without in this province. Far, far too many. We're reporting this year on information, statistics that is, that are derived from tax filer information. Information provided by families about how much they earn. And we're able to take a look at the number of children in a couple of different ways. We're able to look at the number of children from the age of 0 to 17 years of age. We're also able to look at how many very young children between the ages of 0 and 5 are living in poverty. And it's worth noting that both numbers are far too high in a wealthy province like British Columbia. I mentioned a moment ago that there's 153,300 children living in poverty between the ages of 0 and 17 years of age. When we look at the number of very young children, children aged 0 to 5, there are 50,280. One of the very valuable tools that the wonderful people at First Call have come up with in recent years to help us imagine what that means is to think about a city of poor children. Now imagine a city of poor children where there are 153,300 children living in such a city. A city with that population would be nearly the size of the Nanaimo Regional District. And the gravitas of that reality should be arresting. When we take a look at British Columbia in comparison to other provinces and territories in Canada, we have nothing to be proud about. We still boast an overall child poverty rate that is above the national average. A shameful distinction. Some children experience poverty at a much higher rate than others. And it's here that we'd like to cast a bit of light. Overall, there are 18.4% of all children in British Columbia that live in poverty, 1 in 5. When we start looking at special children within the children category, looking to children that are living in families that identify as being recent immigrants, Indigenous families, families that identify as being part of a visible minority community, we see much higher rates of poverty. In fact, when we take a look at the percentage of recent immigrant children, a full 44.9% of those children are living in poverty. That is inching far too close to half. When we take a look at Indigenous children, focusing on off-reserve only, which means that we're dealing with an undercount in this particular case, a full 30.9% of all children are living in poverty. A shamefully high rate. And a rate that prompts ongoing thinking and work about how to make conditions for children in all families better. I'll speak to the recommendations a little bit later, but I do want to foreshadow some real practical things that have been noted. And much of them are structural that would apply to all families. Child tax benefit is a particular one that I'll circle back around to in a minute, and one that we can all easily get behind because we know it lifts children out of poverty. When we take a look at the historical trend and examine the degree to which there may or may not be changes, we see some. We see some change. It's pitifully slow, to use Adrian's great expression. We have 153,300 children that are living in poverty. And last year we had 163,260. It's too slow. Though it is a decrease, it is far too slow a decrease in the total number. We know that children living in different kinds of family compositions experience poverty at different rates. And we know that for lone parent families in particular, the cost of living and the inadequacy of income is often too much, and it translates into a very deep poverty and a high rate of poverty. For children 0 to 17 years of age living in lone parent families, 1 in nearly every 2 children in such families are living in poverty. The lone parent child poverty rate is at 47.7%. By contrast, couple parents have a poverty rate of 11.2%. So clearly where there are 2 parents working, there is greater income, there is a lower poverty rate. Lone parents, by contrast, struggle. And they struggle in a way that is also gendered. We know that nearly 80% of lone parent families were female-led. And we know that many lone parent female-led families are experiencing the brunt of that high rate of poverty, which is simply unacceptable. I mentioned the depth of poverty a few minutes ago, and I'd like to come back to that topic because when we're talking about poverty, we're talking about deep poverty in most cases. When we take a look at the lone parent, one-child reference family, we see a poverty line that's set at around $25,000 per annum. That means $25,000 a year is the after-tax take-home income. And we know that the amount of median after-tax income for such families is at $15,470. So every family that's falling below that line is earning a median $15,470. That amounts to a $10,000 poverty gap. $10,000 would be required to bring the median income up to the poverty line, meaning that the vast majority of families living in that category, lone parent, one child, are living deep, deep in poverty. And it's not any better for lone parents with 2 children. Lone parents with 2 children face a slightly worse economic situation insofar as their poverty gap is $10,822, well below the poverty line set at $30,000 for that reference family. What this amounts to is an insight that most families actually live far below the poverty line. For those folks that are working, of which there are a lot, work is simply not paying. And it's not paying because of the dismally low minimum wage that most families struggle to make ends meet with. When we take a look at single parents with 1 child, they're working full-time. The actual minimum wage take-home pay they'd receive is $18,761. So even if there's, working, we see a poverty gap of around $10,000. We see a similar gap with 2-parent family with 2 children, though it is moderately better with the poverty gap closing to only $3,700. Still meaning that families working on minimum wage throughout the year take home a pay that brings them still below the poverty line. A clear piece of evidence for why the minimum wage must be raised. For those families that are receiving income assistance, it is not a dignified life because the adequacy of income assistance is so dismally poor. And it puts families so deep into poverty that the line is almost out of sight. When we take a look at a couple with 2 children receiving income assistance, their total income would be $23,468. That's 64% of the poverty line income, leaving a poverty gap of $12,000. We have a large province. It's diverse in both the makeup of its people and its geography. And the spatial articulation of child poverty across BC is something worth noting. There are several regional districts, that have much higher rates of child poverty. I'd like to give name to those. The Stikine Regional District, our most northwestern regional district in British Columbia, has a rate of 31.8% child poverty. The Skeena Queen Charlotte Regional District has a rate of 30.8%. Mount Waddington on the coast has 31%, and the Central Coast has a poverty rate of 46.4%. Nearly half of all children in that regional district live in poverty. By contrast, when we take a look at the eastern border of British Columbia that abuts Alberta, we see a very different kind of story. We see lower, still unacceptably high, but nevertheless lower child poverty rates, with the East Kootenay reporting the lowest regional district poverty rate in British Columbia, where East Kootenay has 14% of all children living in poverty. Child poverty rates were especially severe in some of the coastal urban areas, as I've noted. And I'd like to cast a bit additional light into some of the particular cities in these regional districts where there are especially high rates of child poverty. Port Alberni had 28.5% of all children living in poverty. Duncan, BC, 28.4% of all children are living in poverty. And Prince Rupert, where there are 27.3% of all children living in poverty. And on the flip side, there are several cities where the child poverty rate is on the lower end, still too high. Fort St. John had 12% of all children living in poverty. Squamish has 13.2% of all children living in poverty. In Victoria, Census Metropolitan Agglomeration has 14.8% of all children living in poverty. For people that are interested in maps, there's a lot of maps that have been produced as part of the Poverty Report Card in recent years. And we would encourage downloading those maps, using them for local organizing work, with a view of identifying where it's possible specific neighborhoods and areas for community organizing to do things that will help lift children out of poverty and into opportunity. Income inequality is a problem, and though recent census data has indicated that since last go-around of the examination there have been slight national ameliorations in the income inequality profile, the bottom line is that in the past 26 years, income inequality in Canada has increased dramatically. And the way that that shores up for child poverty is in the fact that the richest 10% of BC families with children received a full 24% of the total income, nearly a quarter, while the poorest half of families shared 27%. So the richest 10% of BC families with children received nearly a quarter of all the income, while the poorest half of all families shared 27%. A strong and troubling indicator of the persistence of income inequality in our times. Now, we know that there are things that help. Community organizations and agencies that are working to alleviate strained economic situations through support, peer help, are wonderful. And the world would be much worse without the strong, ongoing, persistent efforts of our awesome civil society organizations. But child poverty is more squarely an opportunity for government to play a stronger role in helping children across BC. We know that government transfers help families with children, and we know that they help a lot in some provinces and less in others. We know that in the case of Quebec, the percentage reduction in child poverty in 2014 due to government transfer payments was a full 47%. And by virtue of the mechanism of a strong public policy to reduce child poverty, the province of Quebec has managed to significantly reduce the number of children that go without, who have resources in their families to go and see their friends and family, to afford healthy food, to access opportunities, to receive supports, to wear clothes that they're proud of and make them feel good. In BC, we have a much reduced version of this. One could say that we have a lot to learn from Quebec. If BC had a government transfer effectiveness similar to Quebec, for example, we could have helped to keep another 101,000 children out of poverty in 2015. I'd like to spend just a minute taking a look at some of these comparisons and the difference that these benefit programs make. In Quebec, the annual benefit amount for one child through their early childhood tax benefit is $2,392. This amounts to a $43,000 lifetime investment in a child. And the benefit is indexed. It appreciates that inflation translates into ongoing increases in the cost of living. And with affordability such a problem in this part of the world, that indexing is an essential part of any progressive public policy pertaining to child poverty. Ontario has a similar yet slightly less robust. And by slightly, I mean nearly half as robust. Let's bring in BC. BC provides an annual benefit amount for one child of $660, and it's geared to a younger age cohort. That amounts to a lifetime investment of only $3,960. So let's lift up that $3,960 amount that BC provides to children and compare it to the $43,056 that Quebec provides over the course of a lifetime. What a difference that would make.